Before rebellion had a name, before pride was carved into Scripture, before Lucifer ever turned his gaze inward and imagined a throne above God's will, there was another fall. It did not come with thunder. It did not split the heavens, and no one sang of it afterward. This angel did not fall screaming defiance. He did not gather followers or raise banners of war. There was no declaration, no challenge, no moment history would later point to and say, "This is where it began." That was why he was forgotten, because his fall was quieter than sin. He fell not because he wanted to rule. In the earliest moments of creation, before heaven hardened into hierarchy and law, angels were not soldiers. They did not question, they did not doubt. They existed in perfect alignment, each fulfilling a purpose so absolute that the idea of choice had no meaning. And yet, among them, there was one whose purpose required proximity. He was not the brightest. He was not the most beloved, that he was the listener. While others sang creation into being, while others shaped light and law, he stood close enough to hear the silence beneath God's voice. Not the commands, but the pauses between them, the hesitation that no angel was meant to notice. He heard something unsettling. Creation was not certainty. It was risk. God did not create because the outcome was guaranteed. He created because he wanted something that could become more than obedience, something that could choose, even if that choice meant fracture. The listener understood this before free will ever entered the world. And understanding was forbidden, not by command, but by consequence. The moment he comprehended that creation could fail, that love could be rejected, that obedience was not the same as devotion, something irreversible occurred within him. Not rebellion, distance. He began to see heaven not as perfection, but as preparation, a place designed to function until something else emerged, something unstable, something alive. Mortals. The listener watched the shaping of humanity with a focus that unsettled the other angels. He did not marvel at their beauty. He did not celebrate their innocence. He studied their fragility, their inconsistency, their terrifying capacity to choose wrongly and still be loved. This was the flaw and the miracle. God did not hide this from him. God allowed him to see it. And in that allowance, the listener made his mistake. He asked a question, not aloud, not in defiance, but internally, where angels were never meant to ask anything at all. What happens if they break? There was no answer. And that terrified him, because if creation was unfinished, then obedience was incomplete. And if obedience was incomplete, then perfection was a lie maintained by momentum, not truth. The listener did not rebel, he withdrew. And withdrawal, in heaven, was indistinguishable from falling. He did not tear his wings from his back. They simply lost their purpose. He did not curse God. He simply could no longer stand where certainty was required. Gravity found him, not physical gravity, but metaphysical incompatibility. He descended through layers of heaven unnoticed, passing through thresholds angels rarely acknowledged because they never needed to. He crossed into a space that was not yet hell, not yet earth, but something unfinished, a place of conceptual residue, where discarded possibilities lingered. Here, the listener landed, because heaven did not yet understand that falling was possible without rebellion. This was the first fall, because Lucifer fell screaming, "I will be greater." The listener fell whispering, "What if this fails?" And doubt was infinitely more dangerous than pride. He watched humanity from afar, unable to interfere, unable to return. He saw them love irrationally. He saw them destroy without reason. He saw them forgive without logic. And slowly, something within him changed. Angels were eternal, humans were not. And yet, humans mattered more. That was the truth that shattered him completely. By the time Lucifer would later rise in brilliance and certainty, rallying angels beneath the banner of deserved glory, the listener was already gone. Unspoken, unrecorded, buried beneath heaven's need to pretend doubt had never existed. Lucifer would fall loudly. The listener had already fallen correctly. And heaven learned something crucial from that first, silent descent. Pride could be punished, but understanding had to be erased. So his name was removed, his function reassigned, his existence denied. Because if angels ever learned that doubt could exist without rebellion, heaven itself would fracture. And somewhere, in the spaces between realms, the first fallen angel waited, not plotting revenge, not seeking redemption, but watching the experiment he had feared unfold exactly as he knew it would. Messy, beautiful, uncontrollable, alive. Exile did not feel like punishment at first. There was no pain in the listener's fall, no tearing of flesh or burning of wings. Angels were not built to suffer the way mortals were. What he felt instead was absence, the sudden removal of harmony. In heaven, everything resonated, every thought aligned, every presence reinforced the whole. Outside of it, silence did not sing back. For the first time, the listener was alone. The space he occupied was unfinished, not empty, but undefined. It bent without rules, held light without warmth, time without direction. It was a place creation had not yet decided what to do with, a margin between intentions. Here, the listener existed without function, and that was more unsettling than any torment could have been. He had been made to listen. Now there was nothing to answer. At first, he tried to return, not through force, not through defiance, but through alignment. He attempted to still his thoughts, to release doubt, to become once more the flawless instrument he had been created to be. But doubt was not a stain that could be washed away. It was a lens. Once seen through, it could not be unseen. He no longer fit. And heaven, sensing incompatibility, sealed itself not with walls, but with certainty. This was when he understood the true nature of his fall. He had not been cast out, that he had been excluded. Lucifer's rebellion would later tear heaven open, forcing judgment, war, and consequence. The listener's fall required none of that. Heaven simply continued without him, quietly adjusting its structure so that his absence would not be questioned. This was mercy, and it was cruelty. In exile, the listener watched creation unfold from a distance God had never intended any angel to occupy. He saw humanity stumble through its earliest moments, awkward, frightened, curious. He saw them break rules they barely understood and invent meaning where none had been provided. He saw suffering emerge not as punishment, but as friction between freedom and consequence. And still, God did not intervene, not the existence of evil, but God's willingness to allow it. The listener had assumed creation was a controlled act, a precise unfolding of perfection. What he saw instead was trust, reckless, terrifying trust placed in beings that could fail spectacularly. He began to understand why angels had not been given choice. Choice was unstable. Choice was dangerous. Choice required endings, and endings were something heaven was not prepared to face. As ages passed, though time did not move normally where he dwelled, the listener felt something new take root within him. Not ambition, not resentment, empathy. He felt sorrow for mortals who struggled beneath the weight of decisions they were never trained to carry. He felt admiration for their resilience. And, slowly, He felt something dangerously close to love. This was the final line he crossed. Angels were not meant to love creation. They were meant to serve it. Love blurred judgment. Love invited sacrifice. Love made obedience conditional. The listener did not act on this feeling that he could not. He had no authority, no access, no voice that reached the living world. But love, even unexpressed, changes the shape of a being. It rewrites priorities that it introduces preference. And preference was the seed of rebellion. Far away, in the heights of heaven, Lucifer was beginning to notice the same flaw, but from the opposite angle. Where the listeners saw risk and responsibility, Lucifer saw injustice. Why should mortals receive freedom angels were denied? Why should flawed beings be loved without earning it? Lucifer's outrage would become fire. The listeners became grief. And grief, unlike pride, does not announce itself. It waits, unseen, unrecorded, patient. The listener realized then why his fall had not been spoken of, why no warning had been issued, why heaven had chosen silence over explanation. If angels ever learned that understanding could lead to exile without rebellion, without wrongdoing, then obedience would no longer feel safe. So his story was buried, and history moved on. Lucifer would fall next. Louder, brighter, remembered, but long before that war shattered heaven's illusion of perfection, the first fracture had already occurred, quietly, invisibly, when an angel understood too much and asked nothing at all. And somewhere beyond the edges of creation, the listener remained, watching humanity stumble forward, knowing that when the final reckoning came, it would not be pride that defined the greatest loss, but doubt. When Lucifer finally fell, the heavens shook, but not from surprise. Heaven had felt the pressure building long before the first shout of defiance rang through its halls. Pride had mass that it accumulated. It distorted alignment until fracture was inevitable. Lucifer's rebellion was dramatic, yes, but it was also predictable. The listener had seen it coming, not because he could see the battle, but because the architecture of heaven changed. Certainty cracked, harmony lost its absolute tone. For the first time since creation, heaven reacted instead of merely existing. War was not divine. It was improvisation. Heaven responded with force, judgment, and narrative. A story had to be told. A villain had to be named. Meaning had to be restored through opposition. Lucifer became that meaning. The listener watched it all with something close to sorrow. Not for Lucifer's fate, but for heaven's need to simplify what had gone wrong. Pride was easier to condemn than doubt. Rebellion was easier to punish than understanding. The story became cleaner, safer, and more incomplete, because Lucifer's fall was not the beginning. It was the echo. Lucifer challenged God's authority. The listener had challenged God's certainty, and that was far more dangerous. Authority could be defended. Certainty, once questioned, could never be fully restored. This was why Lucifer's name was preserved while the listener's was erased. Memory itself became a tool of control. Lucifer's fall taught angels what would happen if they rebelled. The listener's erasure taught them something more subtle. Do not ask why. Heaven did not just punish rebellion. It curated understanding. And so the listener remained unnamed, unwritten, unacknowledged, a shadow cast by a light that refused to see its own edges. Yet his influence did not end with his fall. In exile, he became something new. Not an angel, not a demon, not a watcher by design. A witness. He watched humanity struggle beneath commandments delivered without context. He watched them fail, repent, repeat. He watched them reach for meaning with hands too small to hold certainty. And though he could not intervene, his presence was not without consequence. Where doubt appeared in human thought, unbidden, uninvited, it echoed him. Where compassion arose without instruction, it mirrored him. Where someone questioned authority not to overthrow it, but to understand it, that was his imprint. Not as guidance to as resonance. This was the irony heaven never accounted for. Erasing his name did not erase his influence. Understanding could not be destroyed. It could only be displaced. And displaced truths had a way of resurfacing where they were least expected. Lucifer ruled through defiance. The listener endured through empathy. Lucifer tempted humanity with power. The listener haunted it with questions. Which was more dangerous? He did not seek redemption. He did not seek forgiveness. Those were frameworks built for guilt, and he did not feel guilty. He had simply seen, and seeing had cost him everything. Because if no one bore witness to the risk of creation, then the suffering of the living would be meaningless. Someone had to understand the cost. Someone had to remember that freedom was not a gift without consequence, but it was still worth giving. And so he remained where heaven would not look and hell could not reach, holding a truth neither side could claim. That creation was not perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, though fragile, endured longer than perfection ever could. As humanity's story lengthened, so did the listener's burden. Watching was not passive. To witness suffering without the power to intervene reshaped him more deeply than exile ever had. He learned the limits of empathy, the weight of restraint, the cruelty of unanswered prayer. He heard them, not with ears, but with the same faculty that once let him hear the pauses in God's voice. He heard obedience mistaken for goodness, and he understood something that neither heaven nor hell would ever fully accept. Humanity did not fail because it was flawed. Humanity suffered because it was unfinished, still becoming something even God had not defined completely. This was the risk God had embraced. This was the risk the listener had seen. Lucifer sought to correct it through dominance. Heaven sought to contain it through commandment. Meaning required uncertainty. Love required the possibility of rejection. And freedom required pain. The listener did not absolve God of responsibility for this, nor did he condemn him. He understood something deeper than blame. Creation was not a mistake, that it was a wager, and humanity was the stake. This realization did not turn the listener against God. It separated him from heaven. Heaven required certainty to function. God, however, had acted without it. That distinction mattered. If heaven was order, God was intention. And intention did not require perfection, only willingness. This was why the listener could never return. He had crossed beyond obedience into comprehension, and comprehension was irreversible. Lucifer, for all his fire and fury, never truly understood this. His rebellion was fueled by comparison, by envy of humanity's freedom and resentment of his own constraints. He wanted justice defined by hierarchy. He wanted worth measured by brilliance. The listener wanted none of that. He wanted coherence. He wanted suffering to mean something, not in a moral sense, but in an existential one. So he waited, not for redemption, or why am I chosen, but what am I becoming? That question carried no accusation, only responsibility. And slowly, across generations, it emerged. In philosophers who doubted without despair, in prophets who loved without certainty, in ordinary people who chose kindness without promise of reward. The listener did not guide them, that he resonated with them. like a frequency that only those willing to sit in silence could hear. This was his final role, not fallen angel, not hidden God, but the echo of divine doubt, the reminder that even creation began without guarantees. And when humanity finally stood at the edge of understanding, when certainty lost its grip and meaning became something forged rather than received, the listener felt something he had not felt since before his fall. Not hope, recognition. Creation had caught up to him. He did not ascend, he did not descend. He simply remained where he always had, between what was commanded and what was chosen, between heaven's silence and hell's noise, between obedience and freedom. And in that space, the truth endured. Lucifer fell because he wanted to rule. The listener fell because he wanted to understand. And humanity, unknowingly shaped by both, continued forward, unfinished, fragile, and free. There was no moment when the listener was forgiven, because there was no moment when he was condemned. His existence remained unresolved, suspended outside the structures that required judgment to function. Hell could not claim what had never rebelled, and so he endured in the only place left to him, between definitions. This was not limbo, it was perspective. From here, the listener saw what neither side could admit. Heaven and hell were reactions, not origins. One preserved order by denying uncertainty. The other exploited uncertainty by weaponizing it. Both depended on absolutes. And absolutes, the listener had learned, were fragile things. Humanity lived in the fracture between them, not fallen far enough to abandon meaning, not elevated enough to escape consequence. And in that fracture, something extraordinary persisted. Choice, not choice as temptation framed it, not choice as commandment restricted it, choice as burden, choice as responsibility, choice as the act of becoming something without knowing what the final shape would be. The listener watched humanity fail endlessly and still continue. He watched them destroy each other, forgive each other, betray themselves, and then try again without guarantee that trying mattered. And that was the moment he understood what God had seen from the beginning. Creation was not about outcome, it was about endurance. Not endurance of suffering, but endurance of meaning in the absence of certainty. Heaven had mistaken perfection for stability. Hell had mistaken chaos for freedom. Humanity, stumbling blindly between the two, carried something neither possessed fully: the willingness to live without knowing whether it would all make sense in the end. That willingness was sacred and terrifying. The listener did not speak this truth aloud. He had learned long ago that truth spoken too early became dogma, and dogma strangled growth. Instead, he remained as he always had, present but unacknowledged, shaping nothing directly, yet leaving impressions everywhere. Every time someone questioned authority without hatred, every time someone chose compassion without command, every time someone accepted uncertainty without surrendering to despair. That was him, not intervening, witnessing. And when humanity finally reached the age where it no longer needed heaven to threaten it nor hell to tempt it, when it began, however imperfectly, to take responsibility for its own becoming, the listener felt the final tension ease. Not resolution. Released, he did not rise. He did not vanish, he became unnecessary. And that was the highest purpose he could have served. Because the true measure of creation was not whether it obeyed, but whether it could continue without supervision. Lucifer would always be remembered as the first rebel. The listener would remain forgotten. And that was right, because rebellion demanded attention. Understanding did not. And somewhere beyond myth, beyond scripture, beyond fear and worship, the truth lingered quietly. The first angel did not fall because he wanted more. He fell because he saw enough. And in seeing, he made room for something fragile, dangerous, and miraculous to exist. A world that did not need certainty to continue. Only courage, only choice, only time.